Hello world of YouTube, and welcome to a brand new discography review, one decided on by the patrons over on the Patreon for Patron Appreciation Month. A discography that I'm really excited to tackle because it is a group that came around into my life at a very formative time and has some records that I would regard as some of the best of their genre. They have a very small but very influential discography, and I think that they just make some bops. I'm talking about the French electronic producer duo Daft Punk. Guy-Manuel de Cristo and Thomas Bangalter made up the duo. They made music from the 90s till last year when they broke up. I was going to do this video around that time, and I'd been spinning their discography a lot, and the fact that this one not only gave me an excuse to spin it again, but acted as a good sort of finally talking about a duo that I really enjoy. I think that they, like I said, made a huge impact in the scene, both in iconography and overall sound direction that they went towards. You know, one of their albums, I would argue, was one of the most influential records in the modern pop landscape. They just helped bring back a sound and did it very well, while also creating some foundational work in their own pockets. I think that they are fantastic. They only made 5 albums as a group, if you're not including live albums, which have their own sort of atmosphere and vibe altogether, and remix work, which I used to talk about but don't anymore in this new format. With that being said, I do still have a decent amount I want to say about these 5 albums in particular. Give this video a like already if you're excited, and let's go ahead and get going. Now, yeah, the Tron Soundtrack's going on the bottom, but that feels like the most obvious pick, right? It's not a bad project, and the production on this album is honestly, I think, better than the production on the album ahead of it. However, what's not cool, really cold synthetic work is just sort of generic sounding string swells. It's not awful, but I feel like this album more shines when Daft Punk does their thing. Do I enjoy the moments where they do meld together? Sometimes. Even tracks like The Game Has Changed, which have a good melding of some low synthetic drones with some building strings, I almost wish had a little more going on in dancing with each other, you know? For as much as I like D-Reds, it's also criminally short, and that's the other problem. There are other things that I like on here. I think Son of Flynn is a really good synth sweep. I think The Grid is a fantastic track. And even Disc Wars does have showings of what I hoped was more prominent on this record. However, there's just some fluff and filler and ambient stuff that doesn't do a whole lot for me, and leaves this as easily Daft Punk's weakest project. Is it bad? No, it just sort of exists in the ether as an experience and an sort of enhancement to a movie that itself was also kind of forgettable and just kind of existed, you know what I mean? And obviously, with it being a soundtrack, you don't really have to get to it. If you want to hear Daft Punk trying to meld with some symphonic ideas, it's a decent point of curiosity, but it's not necessarily a point that you really need to end up at either. Now, Human After All had potential to be better than it ended up being. There are songs on here that I enjoy, and overall I think that the idea behind this record is at least neat. But I feel like this bare bones production and what ideas they have here that aren't super derivative of stuff that they had done on records like Homework feels a bit too stretched out and stretched thin for what's really here. Sure, the production is very punchy, but I feel like it has aged the worst out of their entire catalog. You know, I enjoy the suite from The Prime Time of Your Life through Steam Machine. I feel like Make Love is fine, but it's sort of an embodiment of the pitfalls seen in the production on this record. And Television Rules the Nation and Technologic kind of act as the weakest components of this project because at their core, they should have worked. Again, trying to rework that cyclical nature of Homework into something else is what those 2 tracks are aiming for, but I feel like that's an embodiment of the album's ideas feeling stretched too thin. That cyclicalness on those songs does not hit in the same way that it did on tracks like Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger, or tracks from Homework like Defunct. You know, I enjoy parts of this record, but it is the record I've wanted to revisit the least out of this entire discography. It's got good ideas, it just doesn't have enough of them. But with that being said, it feels like a point of curiosity above all else. You may enjoy the hard abrasiveness that this album has going on. You may enjoy some of the hooks. You may enjoy some of the samples woven throughout this project. But it just doesn't hit the mark for me personally. Now, I went back and forth with the next two slots. I knew what was going to be at number 1, and I knew what was going to be in the bottom 2 slots and what order they went. But 3 and 2, I went real hard and back and forth on which I liked more. And ultimately, for everything it does right, I'm putting Homework here, if purely because the 1 and 2 spot are just a bit tighter. But Homework lays the foundation masterfully from which this group and other groups in the electronic scene could sprout from. They pulled their shit in on this record. I mean, the whole idea of this sort of huge album experience out of a sort of radio-style broadcast had been replicated a couple of times since then in other genres. You know, similarly to Twerp's Return to Wherever, it just sort of ambiguously puts you in this afternoon of radio jams. You know, it's got the sort of overture experience with the opener Daft and Direct before going into the radio jingle for the album itself that then explodes, that then bleeds beautifully into this just barrage of bops and fantastic grooves that harness great sample weaving, that cyclical nature that house goes for with these electronic movements that just hit a good stride, with Revolution 909, Defunct, and Phoenix being the embodiment, the tightest core that you could have asked for. Fresh continues that energy with its sort of wave samples, but it sort of acts as a good coda to that before having these two gargantuan embodiments of house music in its prime with Around the World and Rollin' and Scratchin'. I love the groove of both of those songs, and I could listen to them into the morning sun. They are fantastic tunes. This album is one of those that has this huge legacy behind it at this point, and it is a great starting point, honestly. Like, if you're getting into Daft Punk and you want a good, again, idea of what the group has going on in their highest highs, listen to Homework. You know, you could even start at Homework and then just pillage forth through the discography, because you see this growth and evolution naturally throughout the band's work that I feel like is exemplified in its best genesis on Homework. I adore this record. Hell, I threw it on one last time before I sat down to do this review. I was doing some errands and driving around, and dude, it is a great driving record. It really sets the stage. The whole ambient thing bleeds really well in a car setting, and I enjoyed this album a hell of a lot. I thought it was very funky. It's still very groovy, and it holds up immaculately to this day. The fact that this came out in the 90s blows my mind every time I throw it on. Lose yourself to dance. I briefly mentioned this album in my favorite musical shifts of the 2010s video, where I talked about loving them shifting gears from a strictly electronic-infused soundscape into the disco and disco revivalism scene on Random Access Memories. But I also talked about how it was like an incredibly important record to the general trends that music had seen cropping up post its wake. And sure, there were other artists tapping into some 70s adjacent vibes like Bruno Mars with Treasure and stuff like that. But this album here really feels like something special in hindsight, I should say. Not just because it's their last album, but it was an album that I would argue helped really throttle disco revivalism well into the forefront of the general populace. I mean, this record slaps, by and large. It's easily maybe my favorite record from a production standpoint of theirs. The production on this record mirrors the smoothie silkiness seen on that last Silk Sonic record. It's got this vintage touch to it. And it helps that they're strictly doing a lot of live instrumentation and analog synth work on here. I'm always going to be a sucker for analog synths. That's what I love about traditional synthesizer music by Venetian Snares as well. And what Daft Punk does with this album, I think, is incredibly done. You know, not only is it a handful of throwback bops, like your Instant Crushes, which tap into like a synth funk vibe that sounds like something churned out of like a Sega Genesis' sound chip. You've got Lose Yourself to Dance and Get Lucky, two bops with Pharrell Williams at the helm. You've got the very old school Daft Punk sounding Doing It Right with Panda Bear. I really love that collaboration. But you've also got these moments where they get to just do their own version of robot disco funk. Tracks like Beyond and The Game of Love. I also like how not all the collaborations are just bops, like with Julian Casablancas and Pharrell. They've got collaborations with artists like Giorgio Moroder and Paul Williams who add their own Odyssey scale dance cuts that do more to cement the time capsule aspect that this album has going on in its more spacey driven moments. I love this record. I love what it does to act as a time capsule within a time capsule at this point. You know, because from this point you can see loads of acts borrowing from the blueprint that this album laid out, while also acting like a preservation tool to an era that felt long lost by the time this album rolled around. Again, disco revivalism wasn't new, but I don't think at the time of this record anyone was doing it like Daft Punk were on here. You know, they were getting dudes like Giorgio and Nile Rodgers in with modern pop smashes with some fun indie cred in there. This is a great record, honestly. It's a really cool experience in an album section, you know, similarly to records like Homework and the album that I'm about to talk about. It's a cool album experience, which I think is what Daft Punk does at their best. You know, while they've done experiments with like symphonies and minimalism from a production standpoint, they're at their best when they're taking a concept, taking an idea, and really running to the horizons with it. And this is a great example of really them doing that at their core, because this is their last album. It broke up last year with a really depressing video, you know. But I liked this album. I liked it at the time, and it's an album that continues to age like fine wine, in my opinion. Now, I think Discovery is one of the greatest electronic albums of all time, so of course it's at the #1 spot for me. I feel like this took all of the stage setting and foundations from Homework and just refined it into the most concentrated essence of the potential of this group, Daft Punk. It's also a soundtrack to an anime movie, Interstellar, that you don't even need to really watch to get the concept of the album in the way that you would maybe the Tron soundtrack. But I like what Daft Punk are doing on here. It was my jumping on point to the group and continues to give me goosebumps to this day. You know, you've got the iconic bops in the form of One More Time and Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger, which have that cyclical nature that tracks like Around the World did, but again, pulled it together into its tightest form. You've got Digital Love, which sort of laid the groundwork for what I would argue is a huge chunk of the indie-tronica scene, not limited to, but including Owl City. Aerodynamic sounds like the electronic music equivalent to Van Halen's Eruption in the best way possible. You got Crescendo sort of flashing back to Homework from a production style. You've got chill interludes like Night Vision. Superheroes and Voyager almost act like a blueprint with which the future funk genre will continue to adapt to this day. Verdi Quo's got this lush, soft, synthetic touch that I think is so blissful. And Short Circuit is an 80s bop by and large. I love this album. I think it's a classic. I think it is one of the most quintessential albums in its genre. I think it is incredible. I think that it is personally the best jumping on point for Daft Punk because you get that dance style that's seen on records like Human After All and Homework, but again, refined to its best form. You know, you got some funk in there and some, like, disco-influenced sound. Some of the samples are from the 70s on here, and you could see that as sort of again, the blueprint that they would then put into a more traditional space on Random Access Memories. It's like the quintessential Daft Punk album, IMO, is Discography. And I know that that's not a hot take. A lot of people view this album as Daft Punk's greatest. I am just no exception to that rule. I think that this album is an essential listening experience by and large. I think it's an incredible album that took adaptations seen from artists like Kraftwerk, and you can even see like the Herbie Hancock Rocket era, and putting it into this odyssey. And it's easily my favorite Daft Punk album. But that's my thoughts on Daft Punk's discography. Do you like Daft Punk? What's your favorite Daft Punk album? What are some of your favorite Daft Punk songs? Let's talk Daft Punk in the comments down below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general notary content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons if you want to join the ranks to get early access to content, exclusive content, or to help drive the community. It's linked in the description. I'm going to go, though. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You got some good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.